Good afternoon, Ryan. How are you doing today, sir?
What's happening, Mike? How are you?
I am doing well. Here we are. It's another Friday, the end of July, 2024.
Yep.
The year's going.
Yours going by fast, real fast.
Yeah, for sure. So we were talking offline and thought it would be a good idea to get out in front of the changes that are going into place next month with the buyer representation and how that's going to look moving forward for buyers.
Yeah, a lot of people are probably seeing things thrown around on the internet, social media saying the NAR settlement, which is basically National Association of Realtors. Essentially, there's some new rules that are going to be put in place. They start August 17th, and we figured we'd just explain it, maybe give some kind of organic banter back and forth between a lender and a realtor on what I see and what you see and how I think it's all going to work and how you think it's going to work. But um, just explain it in a way that's easy to digest versus, just reading it and going, I don't really know what this means.
Yeah, for sure. So probably the best place to start is, you know, before the change, what does it look like for a buyer? So most buyers are going to be or have been historically represented by a realtor. Um, and those realtors always, well, most always got paid. And in the past, the seller was the one who was paying the buyer's agent, right? And so the buyer's costs, their out of pocket expenses to purchase a home up until now have been their down payment, their closing costs, a home inspection, and an appraisal, right? Is there anything else on there that would be a typical expense that we've run into?
No, I think that for the most part, that pretty much covers it, and to kind of just like back up one step, really the change that we're seeing to kind of explain what the changes that we're talking about is, it has to do with compensation to the buyer's agent. You kind of touched on it a little bit, but there's more transparency around that now, and there's this potential of additional costs to a buyer. So that's what we want to kind of explain and get ahead of here.
Yeah, for sure. So the change, like in the most basic way, moving forward, is that um, any realtor who is representing a buyer in a transaction has to have a contract between the realtor and the buyer that is with regards to how the realtor is being paid and how much they are being paid. And it's a new line item expense to the buyer on whatever dollar amount that is negotiated between the agent and the buyer on how much the agent is going to be compensated for representing the buyer in the transaction. Um, but this expense, right, it's new. So it's on top of the down payment, the closing cost, the inspection, the appraisal. Now we have commission on top of there. Um, but correct me if I'm wrong, that expense, that buyer cost, can be treated like every other buyer expense in the transaction, the way that we have treated them in the past. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a concession. So really, to kind of go back to the way that it's been done for, many, many decades, is that there's a or actually when there's a listing agreement, there's an expectation to pay a commission to sell a home. That commission is then split up between the listing agent, the buyer's agent. They figure out what the percentages are going to be, and then that was thrown into the MLS. Well, the MLS like held all the secrets, right? Like the buyer didn't really know how much the realtor was really making. Well, now that secret's kind of out of the bag, and on top of that, if the listing agent or the seller decides they're not going to offer commission, right, to buyers agents, and potentially that commission now to represent and write that offer, it lies on the shoulders of the buyer. And that's the major change right there. That's the major risk that everybody's worried about, is they're saying, wait a minute, how am I going to pay for that? I can barely pay my closing costs, my down payment. How am I going to come up with another 1%, 2%, 3%, whatever the compensation might actually be? And I actually in the past think it was interesting because, again, you would have one listing maybe was paying a buyer's agent 3%. Another one might pay them 1%. They varied, on how much compensation was kind of tossed around out there. So The difference now is when you have that buyer broker agreement, you're locked in essentially to a specific compensation structure. Is that the way that that's the way I understand it? I mean, you kind of fill me and make sure I'm presenting it correctly.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, California just released those forms a day or two ago. Like they've been going back and forth with the Department of Justice on revisions and how they're going to handle it. But yeah, now there's, like I said, it's a contract between the buyer and their agent, and it spells out in there how much the agent is to be paid. And then one other change, I guess, is that you alluded to in the past, like, the commission was between the seller and the agent representing the seller. And then the agent representing the seller would put in the MLS the amount of commission that they were willing to pay the agent that was representing the buyer. So another change is that field of offering any kind of compensation publicly, like you had said, and even privately. Now, there's a whole bunch of caveats to that, but it is no longer going to be allowed to go into the MLS to disseminate that information to the other agents. And so now the buyer's agent is going to be kind of flying blind on, like, okay, I've agreed that the buyer and I have agreed that they're going to pay me X amount of money, and I no longer know how much the seller is going to pay, if anything. And so now that's going to be a topic of conversation on every single offer that goes out. That's not a buyer problem. That's a workload thing for the realtor on both sides, representing the seller and representing the buyer. But now let's look at how this potential additional expense is going to, how we think it could play out in having an impact on the market and on how things go with buyers.
Yeah, I mean, I think that let's just play out a scenario, okay? Hypothetically, let's say that you've got a real estate agent who's going to represent a buyer. They've agreed on, I'm just going to throw a number out, 2% in compensation, right? Whatever that loan amount is, or sales price is, they're going to receive 2% in compensation. They agree on it. They plug it into the buyer broker agreement, and they go out and write offers. And they write offers on like 3 different houses. One of them's paying 0.5% to the buyer's agent. One of them's paying the full 2. One of them's paying 1. So the cost to the buyer is different with all 3 homes. So that's one particular problem, in my opinion, is now if you've got a tight buyer who doesn't have the capital behind them to pay those closing costs. I mean, let's face it, most of the time when we see buyer activity, they can barely put together their down payment and their closing costs. Now we're throwing in commissions on top of that. They're going to be stretched a little bit thin. So, but they really should have free choice on which property they go after, and it shouldn't really be related to how much compensation variance is going to be between one property and another. But remember, they can still counteroffer or negotiate. So maybe they really want property A, and that's paying the least amount of compensation, which means they have to come up with the difference, or we have to come up with some creative financing structure to finance some of those compensation, shortcomings. But they can always negotiate. They can go back to the seller and go, look, we really want to buy the house. This is the price we're offering, and then kind of essentially build that in. It's kind of like when we asked for closing cost credit in the past. Maybe a buyer needs 3% closing cost credit, and we find out that, that's $12,000 on a $400,000 loan amount. So they'll just go in and they'll ask the seller, hey, we need 3% with this offer, and they'll build it into the price. They're going to kind of do the same thing when they offer moving forward. It's just an additional step. And commissions have always been negotiable. So it's not really any different. It's just who's negotiating what. That's the part that's changing a little bit. But there is that concern, especially when this first came out. They're like, all of that comp is going to go on top of a buyer who's already stretched thin. It's going to destroy the real estate market, right? And then sellers are going, sweet, we don't have to pay as much commission to sell our house. And I don't actually think that's the case either. I think if you put your house in the market without the proper compensation behind it, you're not going to get the proper offers, right? You're going to get offers that are going to consistently ask for it because the buyers just don't have it on their side anyways. So my opinion is it's not really that much different, all net out, like dollars being spent by everybody. I think it ends up being about the same. It's just a new negotiation tactic on top of everything else that you typically negotiate when you buy a property. What is your opinion on it? I mean, this is the part you and I haven't really talked about. This is kind of like, for you guys like kind of listening or watching, this is all like off script. I've had my opinion on it. You've had your opinion on it. It's the first time we're bringing it to the table.
Yeah, so I mean, it's going to be, like you said, like the process isn't changing, right? Or shouldn't. And it's always, so any realtor, right, who is good at what they do, and negotiations is, in my opinion, a large part of that. Um, as a realtor, we have a fiduciary responsibility to the client, right? And that's to do essentially the best for them that we're capable of doing, right? And so part of that, in my opinion, is going to be reducing the out-of-pocket expenses for the buyer if it's possible, right? And so if they're on the hook for paying a commission now, and that commission can be covered by a concession from the seller, like everything else has been for the longest time, then my job is to negotiate as much of a concession from the seller towards the buyer's closing costs as possible, right? Well, as long as that's what the buyer wants, right? If the buyer's concern is like, hey, I want to come out of pocket for as little as possible, and weigh that out on, like, I understand that asking for more money from the seller may decrease my chances of success, but I'm okay with not getting this house if it means that I don't want to get the house if I can't afford it, right? So as long as that's the buyer's objective, like, that's my job. Like, legally, I have a responsibility to do what they want to the best of the ability. So I don't think that's going to change at all. Like I said, it's going to be more of a workload thing on the realtors is really the only change. And for the buyer, like, they're up front, those conversations might be a little awkward or uncomfortable for them. Because, like you said, most buyers can barely put together all of the money for their down payment and for their closing costs. And now you're throwing another, you gave the example of, 2% on a $400,000 purchase would be another $8,000, right? And when they're already struggling to do the other out of pocket, an additional $8,000 might be a tough pill to swallow, right? But that's the job of the agent, is to come to them and be like, hey, look, like, potentially here's what the worst case scenario could be, and why you want to work with me, and the value that I'll add to you is like, hey, look, I'll get this chopped down, and just go through that whole discussion with them, and having the conversation with the buyer on why the agent thinks that they are the best fit for that buyer and their representation, and why they think it's their best choice. Right. And then, like you said, everything's always been negotiable. And buyers and sellers, right, always have the ability to interview multiple agents before making a decision. So, with that, like, I remember in the past, people, I would hear an agent tell a buyer, like, hey, look, like, you don't have to pay me. Like, my services are free. Right. And whatever your perspective on that is, like, that was an easy out of a conversation with the buyer on that. And that's no longer a possibility. I mean, the way that I understand it now, and things could have changed in the final days of all of this. Like I said, they just released the forms this week. The way that I understood it is that agents are not allowed to take a buyer and show them a home without first having that representation agreement signed.
Correct.
And that's probably best business practice for agents anyway. Like, I wouldn't, an agent wouldn't represent a seller without some, guarantee of compensation for doing it. And so now they're just applying that to the buyer as well.
So let me ask you this, because I mean, this is a question I don't know if I have an idea on it, but you may be able to answer it. Is, let's say that the buyer woke up Saturday morning. This happens all the time. Woke up, they ate their French toast, and they're like, you know what? I'm going to go buy a house this weekend. I'm tired of paying rent. Screw that. I don't want to pay rent anymore. And they go out and they go to look at a house. Now, at that point, to go show them the home, you got to have them sign a buyer broker agreement. Now, are they stuck and committed to you? Is in the agreement, does it say how long they need to work with you for?
So there's
Or did I just throw you like a gigantic grenade and loaded question?
no, there are a couple forms that we have the choice to use, a couple of different forms that we have the choice to use to address the situation, which is silly to me. I think it should just be one, because I think it's overcomplicating it. But in there, there is the option, like I can say, like, you're the buyer. You call me, hey, I want to go see this house on Main Street. I'm like, okay, cool. Like, but in order to do that, like, I have to have you sign this agreement that's between you and I, and it says that you're going to pay me, you know, 5 golden bars to go sell you this house, right? But so you can say in there, like, there's like a time frame. You can do 6 months, you can do a date range in there, whatever that may be. You can make it property specific. Like, hey, look, like, if you want to see that house, I'll show it to you. But I have to have an agreement saying that if you end up buying that house, that I get paid. And I can give this agreement and it's only for that property, right? Like, there's options that go with it. And then, unfortunately, I will say that I have to imagine that there will be some people who won't get that form signed before showing a house. And I think that that's bad business practice. Like earlier I said, I think it's good business practice that happened anyway. And anybody who chooses to do that, I think, is doing the client a disservice and themselves a disservice. Because if the buyer is going to have this expense, they should know about it up front. I mean, again, back to people not having enough money to, do the down payment and closing cost. And if it's an extra $8,000, they might choose to not buy a house if they're going to have to eat that $8,000. And now you just wasted your time, you wasted their time. Like, it's just, right? So the form has options on it. I do believe it should be signed up front. It's supposed to be signed up front, and I'm a believer that it should be signed up front for all of the right reasons. And a buyer doesn't have to sign it. That might mean they don't get to see the house. But if someone's going to, make you give them their first child, right? Like, you don't have to sign it, and you can call another agent. But it's just going to bring a lot of transparency to the game.
The buyer needs to know what that cost is going to be, because if they actually like the house and they want to write the offer on it, they need to know what they want to negotiate. What do they want to build in the compensation into the package? Do they want to just pay everything out of their own pocket? What do they want to be on it? They need to know what they're getting into. And this leads me to, like, where I think the buyers are going to stub their toe big time is, we've already seen in the past, they're like, okay, so this agent, I think they're great. They're going to pay me, or they're getting paid, in the example we've been running with, 2%. My aunt is a licensed real estate agent. She's never done a deal, but she got her license, and then, back in 2023, and just never did anything. She's going to charge me $500 to go write the offer and go show the house. So I'm going to save a bunch of money. I can get a better deal on the house. Now, did you get a better deal? Maybe. But on the table, like, you don't know what you missed out on. You don't know if you had more negotiating room. You don't know if you discovered something that the property, this person has zero history, zero background on what they're actually looking at, or some pitfalls that you may be running into that potentially cost you way more. And at the end of the day, remember that comp that you're going to sign. And a lot of these buyers are going to get super nervous about signing it, seeing how much they're on the line for. The majority of that time, I'm convinced that comp will be built into the structure of the offer. And it's not going to be a direct out-of-pocket cost for the buyer. It's been that way for years. It's going to continue to be that way for a long time. But I think seeing the numbers is going to freak them out for a second. So the immediate thing most people do is they run for the cheapest. The cheapest a lot of times cost way more down the road. And so, I want to be sure that anybody that kind of listens to this, thinking about buying, they know somebody that's going to be buying, you need to interview. Actually, this is your job as a buyer. Interview the real estate agent that is going to be working for you, just like you interviewed the lender. When somebody calls us, they're like, I don't know, why should I use you versus XYZ bank down the street? we have to have a reason why, this is what we're going to do. This is the way we view the market. This is our services. We need to have some supporting reasons why they want to use us versus another bank. If the interest rate's exactly the same, it doesn't make any difference. Like use, whoever you want. If there's a clear difference in value, you need to go with the person that you either feel the most comfortable with or is bringing the most value. And the same thing with the real estate agent, right? So interview them, ask them like point blank, ask the buyer's agent, like, hey, so you're getting paid X amount of dollars. Great. Like, what can I rely on you for as you go out and represent me? If they don't have an answer for it, first sign you got to bail, right? Or if they don't even give you the form in the first place, now you really got to bail because they haven't been transparent with what the cost is, and you could potentially negotiate incorrectly and get held, stuck holding a gigantic bag of money that you need to come up with at the end of escrow, right? So there's some potential issues. I think we're going to see some people definitely stub their toe, both real estate agents and buyers. But that's what we've seen on our side. I think it's going to be sort of business as usual. It's just going to be a lot more conversation between a buyer's agent and listing agent negotiating everything out, a little bit more so than normal. It's a new component that has to be discussed, but it's a pretty quick component because you guys are professionals and you kind of get to the point on that stuff pretty quick. So I think that's that's our perspective on it. We were nervous about a couple of loan programs that were not in compliance with this. This was actually going to make it very difficult, VA being one of them. Our veterans were going to have an absolutely challenging time with this compensation structure if it went the wrong way. But VA has done a temporary lift on it. So pretty much any program that's out there has adopted some form or another, some new strategies related to compensation because there's a concession limit a lot of times on these loan programs. So if the real estate agent's soaking up the majority of the concession, you can't get any money for closing costs, right? They've made some adjustments for that so that we have a little bit more room now.
Yeah, for sure. Well, while we're on there, is the concession limit for FHA and VA, is it still 6%?
So VA was 4. That was one of the challenges, is that if you were paying out 2-3%, there was like wasn't anything else. Plus there was some rules around paying out a real estate agent in the first place on VA. But yeah, like FHA loan 6%. But the compensation to an agent, whether somebody's paying it or not, is going to be outside of that concession range. So it'll, again, on the loan side of it, it's really kind of normal. And there are ways in some cases to finance if you end up getting stuck holding the bag on it and you can't negotiate it. Maybe you got a better deal on the price of the house, but we just have to work it into the loan financing. So we've had to kind of get creative with the way that we put some of these together as like a plan B if we need to. But there's solutions for all of that.
And there's negotiation tactics for sure on that any realtor that is good at what they do will be able to get that taken care of. Like I said, fiduciary responsibility to the client to do what they want. And if what they want to do is minimize their out-of-pocket expense, that's my job. Thankfully, I think I'm pretty good at my job. So I don't think it's a lot to be concerned about. Honestly, I think that the whole thing is a lot to do about nothing, because the way that I understood the problem coming about on a national level to begin with, I don't feel like that was a problem in California. Like, I think that California got that thing right, as far as the transparency on how everybody was being paid. But in other states, I guess it wasn't. And so now we have to deal with it on a national level. I think it's just, like I said, it's just going to create some conversations up front is really going to be the only difference. And then it might be a deciding factor for a buyer on which house they end up buying or not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and it'll encourage them to interview more agents.
Yeah. And there'll be some listings that, take it and run with it, right? And get super stringy, I'm only paying out X. It's kind of been that way before in the past. Like we've all seen those listings that, they want to get super thin on how much comp they're going to pay out to sell their house. But the funny thing is, in the past, though, that was disclosed, right, in NMLS, and then you wouldn't get the showings because the agent, oh, we're not going to show that. We're not making any money on this thing. So it was a deterrent. Well, now it's just a deterrent, but it's based because you got to call and find out, like what's getting paid out on this thing, and It's just another way to go. So instead of making it easy for somebody to see it, they got to go through a few extra steps, kind of figure out what the comp is and what their buyer potentially would be on the line for, or how they got to negotiate.
All right, I think we're good on that. Is there anything else you want to cover with that on what that could look like as this starts to roll out in the next few weeks?
No, I think the caution is really just for buyers, 'cause primarily that's what we do is we work with buyers at the loan side of things. And I know immediately, as soon as somebody signs that, I'm going to get a phone call. It's like, wait a minute, what's this compensation thing? How you told me closing costs for this, how much is so don't worry as much about it. Obviously be aware of it. You want to relay the info back to us. So the lender and your buyer's representation, your real estate agent who's representing you as a buyer are going to work together to make sure you get the best deal on the house and make sure a lot of these costs are covered if we can, right? So again, I think it's going to end up in the majority of situations, it's going to end up being business as usual across the board. It's just a little bit, a couple extra pieces of paper, a little bit more transparency around it, but it does have the potential of freaking somebody out in the very beginning. So a nervous buyer who's already nervous about the market, nervous about down payment and closing costs might see that and run for the hills. I want to make sure that they don't do that. That's why we want to have this call so we can at least explain what the heck it is so that they don't feel like, great, now I can't buy a house, I don't have extra cash. It's not actually going to cost you a whole lot extra money, if anything.
For sure. Alrighty, well, I'm sure there's going to be questions on that.
Yeah, load them up because I think the question part of it's this is something that you read online. Like some people have gotten it wrong. Some people have a lot of questions about it. I think we've spent enough time, you and I both just kind of like reading it and kind of figuring out how it's going to play out. So I think we're ready for it.
Yeah, for sure. All right, guys. If you guys have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. You can comment on here, call, text, email, direct message, whatever's best for you. And we will do our best to give you the answer that you need. And, if it's something you don't like, again, there's plans that we can come up with and figure out how to best move forward, forward the client for you guys, and what that'll look like and what it'll need to look like moving forward.
Yep. All right. Sounds good. Thanks, Mike.
Awesome. Thanks, Ryan. I will talk to you soon, sir.
All right, guys. See ya.
Bye.